Nice. All right, everybody, we are back. I am Steve Kwan for Fighting Matters. We've also got Mike Mahaffey on the line from Old Bastard Jiu-Jitsu. Say hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Oh, God, I knew you were going to do that. Fucking dad.
I'm a dad.
puns.
Come on. Exactly. I'm an old dad. Hi, everybody. It's good to see y'all. Appreciate you guys.
Nice. And we've got Jesse Walker from Rough Hands BJJ back again. How's it going, Jess?
It's going great. Glad to be here. Love to chat.
Nice. And we're crossing the streams because we also have Tim Lee Peterson back, who was just on the podcast. And so now we are combining the audiences, which is very exciting. This is mostly because Mike has a man crush on Tim and has been trying to get him on the line for a long time.
It's like a podcast Voltron.
Yep.
Oh, my God. Yes. Oh, that's perfect. I want to be the green one.
Except that presumably when Voltron combines, it combines into something strong and powerful and useful. And I'm not sure that we're doing that, but we'll find out. We'll talk about this. So,
my hips are not strong and powerful and useful, so maybe not. Maybe something weak and decrepit.
Well, we probably don't need to do that much in the way of intros because we've already all been on here before. But Tim, you had a great idea for a topic, and it's funny you bring this up because I've kind of got like a notes file, a list of things I want to talk about, and you hit a big one right on the head there. Maybe I'll turn it over to you. What's the thesis for today? What's the thing we want to unpack here?
Yeah, so I think the word that comes to mind is identity. And I think that a lot of times when people talk to each other from maybe the left and the right sides, they want to be effective in their language and their arguments, but it feels like they miss each other with the points that they make. And it could be that they don't see the same facts, or it could be really any number of things. But what I think it comes down to is when you identify with something or some group of people, it colors and provides a lens through which you see the world. And it can be tough to move that lens around or change your perspective, especially when you feel like you're being attacked by the people whose side they're trying to beckon you towards. And so I think one thing to talk about is, well, what is this identity that we have or share? What are these values? And how are they actually expressed in the world? And how do they manifest? And if we know that, can we then understand maybe politically what is happening that contributes to those values being expressed and what is detracting from those things?
I love it. I love it. And what do you mean when you say identity? Like, what does that mean to you? And can you give me some examples of how this might manifest in the discussion?
Yeah, I think that for the most part, on the whole, most human beings value the people that they know, their family, their friends. They want to help them when they can. They want to be able to ask them for help when they need it. They want to have reliable ways to work and to enjoy their family and to eat, and all these things that seem very simple and obvious, but don't just spontaneously emerge in nature. They have to come from something. And we work together as humans cooperatively to make that happen. And so we value these things in ourselves and in other people. And we sort of create these institutions that are supposed to express those values in what we call laws and in institutions to help protect people who can't protect themselves when rights might be infringed upon, things like this. But sometimes the way that those values are taught to people or the way that they're propagated among people, it's sort of packaged alongside some other assumptions and other ideas that maybe aren't dangerous by themselves, but in groups and when they are allowed to continue to grow, they can become dangerous. And I think that's some of what we're saying now.
So what would be an example of that? I'm guessing that probably most people who are listening, regardless of their political persuasion, they could probably come up with some examples. But what's one that maybe you've seen where identity kind of gets in the way of people connecting and actually solving problems?
Sure. I think I'll start with the progressive side just to try and give a fair shake on both sides. But I think a lot of times progressives come to this persuasion after some form of education or experience. Maybe it's in the university, so I'll just use that example for simplicity. You go to a university, you have some education, you specialize and study in some field, and you feel like you have some knowledge or expertise about the world, and maybe you do in this domain. So you begin to inform yourself about other topics, and you want to better understand the world, and you open up your mind a little bit, and you try to talk to somebody who maybe disagrees with you. And you try to relay to them various facts that show, in your mind, that maybe they're contradicting themselves, or maybe they don't actually, are not actually expressing the things they think that they value. But if you do that, and let's say this person now is on the right, this person may have been brought into their political beliefs because they grew up in a community where they were brought to this specific church, And at this church, they met a lot of people who were all very good people, treated them very well, and they were brought up to uphold other values. And they think that they are also valuing cooperation and community and family and things like this. But the way that it should be expressed, when they try to argue that point to someone who went to a university, they feel like they're missing and they're not seeing the argument from this moral position. And so the person who came from the university and the person who grew up inside of a church, and again, they're not mutually exclusive, but they tend to make arguments towards each other that feel like attacks towards the person receiving them. When instead, if they both understood, we mutually live in a society where there's this thing called government that is supposed to express the values we have, but we just disagree about how that's happening. I think sometimes people just simply feel attacked by one side or the other instead of being able to hear how these values could be shared amongst them.
Yeah, I would be inclined to agree. Something that I've heard people say a lot recently is that politics in America has become a team sport. And I think that's very true. I think that many people take their position based not necessarily on whether they truly believe it's good or bad, but rather whether it is something that their team supports or something that they think will hurt the other team. I think that is way too common. And of course, people listening to this podcast will probably think this is taking a shot at the right, which maybe it is, but that isn't the intent. Everybody does this. It's bad on all sides. And it's also very common. I think especially when you have a two-party system, it's even more common because by definition, it's either you or it's the other. Right? There's only two options. You're either with us or you're with them. I think it's probably a little bit harder to kind of fall into that trap if you're in a system that's got like 5 political parties that you could choose from. But up here in Canada, I mean, we're kind of starting to see a similar thing. A lot of, we traditionally have been a multi-party country, but a lot of the other parties are kind of collapsing and really 2 of them are kind of solidifying. And I worry that turning into a 2-party country is going to lead to some of the same excessive tribalism that we see in the States, right? We already have it up here in Canada, but I think it's just going to get worse because, again, once politics stops being about how can we help the most people and starts being about how can I make sure my team wins, like, I don't think you're really acting in the best interests of the country anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, when you all were discussing this, I think about it definitely in terms of, identity being very much about the jerseys that we wear. And a lot of us wear multiple jerseys, right? And we know psychologically that, our brains are built to respond to being in a group. This whole tribalism, it's where we need community, we need connection. And we get very defensive about that community and that connection when it feels threatened, right? Right or wrong. And I think that's important. Sometimes right and wrong doesn't even necessarily come into the calculation for some people because my group, this thing that it feels like my life is dependent upon is being attacked. And that's just completely unacceptable. So rather than analyzing the contents of what is being presented to me, just dealing with it as an attack and immediately dismissing it, I feel like is where we're operating right now.
Yeah.
On most fronts.
I would agree. We had some of you know that I recently had an internet argument with a bunch of people because, that's super useful and you get so much learning out of those things, right? But I found, Jesse, that I was emotionally feeling those same things that you said, like immediately feeling attacked and defensive. And, for context, both my wife and I are social workers, and she's often way wiser than I am. And so we were talking about this, and she looked at some of the things that were being said, and she was like, why don't you just start trying to use I statements? Instead of like, you're wrong or this or that, I feel like this when this happens, therefore can we do, which kind of depersonalizes it. And that really helped me figure out if I was going to respond at all, like how I was going to respond and what I was trying to get at and trying to depersonalize the whole thing and make it about coming together instead of like just beating on each other in this comment section. And it's really, I feel really frustrated when people who basically have similar values start arguing over the minutia of that. And I think we see it within, I would dare say I'm on the left, so I think we see that sometimes within those of us on the left, and even more so between the right and the left. Like, we all want to live in a safe house and have our families have food and have, our basic needs met. I don't know where I'm going with this, except it just drives me crazy that we're at this point arguing this much about things that we all need and want, and we should be working together to give each other.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Mike, I will take your advice and use an I statement in that I personally spend a lot of time trying to keep my, there's a saying, it's not an original idea, but I try to do everything I can to keep my identity as small as possible and really associated with more internal things rather than these externalities that we associate with our identity. Because it's less that I feel like I have to protect. It's less than that I get defensive about, because I don't own those things. Those things don't define me in the way that I feel like happens. And I've certainly been trapped by it before in the past, but as I've started to let some of that go, I found a lot more peace in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about as you were both talking right now that started with what Mike said. I notice when I know the person in real life and we disagree about something, I'm very willing to, every statement they make to me, I can have a question in my mind or a statement in my mind, which is essentially, this is their best understanding of the world right now. And it's a question for people I know. Is this your best understanding of the world right now? This is my best understanding of the world right now. When I'm online with people I don't know and they're just strangers, it's more of a, this is your best understanding of the world right now? And it's like, it's the same thing essentially, but it's a lack of whatever you want to call it, patience or willingness to expand, or it could be any number of things. But I know that with people that I know in real life, when I have that perspective of this is your best understanding of the world right now, it gives me the types of questions that I think actually open something up with them sometimes. Like, what does that mean if this is your best understanding of the world? What does that mean must be occurring in the entirety of the world for what you just told me to be true? That people are harvesting organs to sell, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Versus I just assume online sometimes, this is your best understanding of the world. That's why you wrote this thing. And sometimes I might be a little bit caustic with you, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. It's a good point. Identity is so hard, and especially on the internet. I mean, I'm currently feeling that the comment section might be the worst thing humanity has done to itself since like nuclear arms proliferation. I mean, it is almost impossible for anything good to come out of the comment section. And I think part of the reason is, in addition to having our own sense of identity, there's just something inherently dehumanizing about talking to someone that you don't even know, disassociated. It's just words on a screen. It's easy for that to bring out the worst in all of us. And it's also easy for us to then paint the other person with all sorts of assumptions and brushes about what we think a person like that must be like, kind of informed by our own tribalistic biases. I mean, as an example, right? When we put out episodes like this, there's always a bunch of comments that respond to us and say, you guys are a bunch of like woke left-wing Democrat idiots. And I'm thinking like, okay, first of all,
that's true, by the way.
I mean, not
Especially
really.
The idiot part.
The idiot part,
Fair.
I will see it as true. But I mean, I'm not a Democrat. I mean, I'm Canadian. We don't have those. Like, so it's actually really interesting.
Still Democrat.
I have to explain this sometimes to my American friends. But if you go to like a border state, maybe like Washington, and then you keep going north, right, on a map up, eventually there's a border you cross. And the cool thing is, when you do that, it's actually a different country. And that means that there's like different laws. There's different political parties. So like the idea of a Democrat or a Republican, this isn't like some worldwide thing. It's not like they have Democrats and Republicans in Somalia. Those are two American political parties. We have different ones. I would not even agree with the assessment that I'm left wing particularly. My personal preference is to take good ideas wherever they come from, and sometimes those might come from places that I wouldn't normally support or vote for. So I think that is an interesting assumption that people often put forth is if you don't agree with them, they assume that you must then be in the other camp, and they'll make all sorts of assumptions about you. And that really kills the conversation because you've dehumanized the person. You're talking over each other rather than to each other, right? You're talking to some mental construct of like a liberal that you think this person is, rather than actually talking to the human being in front of you. And I think social media makes that incredibly hard to break out of.
Yeah. I mean, I see it on both sides. You know, if we're going to talk about this binary, I definitely see it from people who are anti-MAGA. Right. I mean, let's just use MAGA instead of Republican right now, because that seems to be what the far right in the United States has become. And I see people saying, if you voted for Trump, you know, you're terrible, you're awful, you're racist, you're this horrible human being who, you know, I never want to talk to again, and you screwed us all over. And I can empathize with those feelings, and I guarantee you there are some people who voted for the current administration who are probably all of those things. But I think to throw everybody in a basket like that without understanding who they are on a human level really makes it almost impossible to repair what's happening in the United States right now. You know, and as frustrated as I am with so many things this administration is doing, I still have kept friendships with people who voted differently, even though I vehemently disagree with their reasons for doing so, because like when it's all over, I don't want to hate half of my countrymen, right? I mean, geez, that'd be terrible.
That's very true. That's something I can definitely improve on. I'm a bit of a chatterbox, and sometimes I have trouble not making my opinion known. Maybe I could be a little bit more temperate about it. So note for my own little storage right there.
I mean, this is a place where people on the right, I think, do have a point, right? You should be able to, within reason, speak your opinion without fear of someone jumping down your throat about it, right? And I don't think I want to live in a world where everyone is so afraid of sharing ideas. Because I mean, we've been talking about this a lot, right? Keep politics out of jiu-jitsu, they always say. Well, a lot of that comes from this idea that as adults, as soon as you start speaking about opinions, we just don't have the maturity to deal with that properly, which I really think we can outgrow. I mean, I've been at gyms full of like, you know, Republican MAGA people, and I find it actually quite interesting to sit down and talk to them and understand what they're thinking. And every time I do, it's always comes up being way more rational than you would have expected if you just read the comment section. And the problem is those people in the comment section do exist, right? And especially on the internet, they're the ones who are most prolific. So if the internet is the lens through which you see the world, you will see a bunch of raging, like fascistic assholes and similarly, you will see a bunch of like woke left-wing assholes. There's a lot of assholes on the internet. But my experience has been every time I sit down with someone who voted for Trump and I ask them to explain why, they can always give me a really cohesive, rational answer for why. I might not agree with it. And frankly, they probably don't agree with it anymore after the last few months, but I can understand the logic that would have led them there. Usually there is some sense of desperation, betrayal from the other party, which is often earned, right? So you never get to have those conversations, though, if you just dismiss people based on the label they're wearing and like the jersey color that they're wearing.
Well, and you know, this is not just a left and right problem. I mean, it's something we've talked a number of times about is the nonsense purity testing shit that happens on the left of, you know, if you're not to Mike's internet argument earlier, right? Your whatever stance on this doesn't matter anymore because you don't also have your stance on this and this and this and this. And then it ends up just turning into a circular firing squad and everybody's dead.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Tim, was it you we were talking about the yes and philosophy in the last episode? I think it was.
It
I've
might have been.
recorded
You got a couple episodes, yeah.
I've recorded so many conversations in the last few weeks. So in improv comedy, there's this idea that they call yes and thinking. And basically the idea is when you're doing improv, you never want to shut down the conversation because it makes for terrible humor, right? One person says something to the joke and the other person says, no, we're not going to do that. Well, the whole bit's dead now. It's awkward. The audience is going to be upset. So in improv, when you're working with a group, you never shut down someone's ideas. You say yes and. And so you pick up the ball they give you and you continue the joke and you add your own flavor over it and then you hand it back. And one thing that I guess you could traditionally call them the left, that people on that side are quite poor at doing is that kind of yes and thinking. They tend to be very focused on where your deficiencies are rather than where your, rather than where your commonalities are. And this is one thing that the right, to their credit, is exceptionally good at. Tim, I was telling you this story just the other day. I've got a friend who was having a serious mental health crisis, not a religious person, but he went to a church and they embraced him and took him in and made him feel comfortable and made him feel like he belonged somewhere. And I don't think people on the left would have done that if a crazy raving person, just like wandered into their door and was having all sorts of problems. I'm not sure people on the left would have done that all the time. So there's kind of a kindness and an ability to include people that I think it's very easy to lose on the left because, understandably, people get so righteously angry about things. But Jesse, you brought up purity testing, right? You can kill a lot of good movements and a lot of good ideas by purity testing because nothing is ever good enough. There's a saying in the business world that an organization will be as successful as the ability to say yes, right? Good ideas will die on the vine real quick if there's a lot of opportunities for someone to say no. This is why if you work in a really bureaucratic big company, nothing ever gets done. It's because you got to get 6 people above you on the chain to say yes. If any one of those people say no, you don't take a step forward. And I feel like progressive causes sometimes bite themselves in the ass because people cannot look past their differences or disagreements and focus on the important things that bring them together. And I think that's a big part of the reason why sometimes people on the left fail to reach out to and absorb and connect with people on the right.
Yeah, one note about that is you kind of see this inclusion from, let's say, the right, where they're finding reasons to bring people in, ways to include them. And then you can see an extension of that where it kind of gets problematic, where maybe you're a bit too forgiving of, 34 felonies, whatever you want to call it, like any number of things. But you see like the benefit of that on the other side, where they're able to bring more people in. But the trade-off is essentially it's very hard to kick someone out because now you've created this standard that if anyone passes through, you also probably have to kick them out. On the flip side, as you're saying, on a more progressive side, you want to have the most factually correct argument because you want to have this policy discussion with someone. But then the moment someone is slightly off of where you are keyed in, they're cut out and removed from the group. So on one side, you're building up a lot of group membership and not really kicking people out. And on the other side, you're looking for reasons to subdivide. And that's not really how you build a strong coalition. But you can understand why it happens is because you're trying to use the rhetoric and the process of argumentation to improve your position. This is what a progressive person would probably think. But maybe not realizing that the trade-off, it's very hard to bring new people in until they're like totally well-versed in every single topic and can give you every reason why. When it's like, no, your job is to educate people and just identify on the same values. We value the same things. This is what it kind of looks like in 2025 for a government to express those values. It's actually kind of complicated, but we can get you up to speed.
Well, and that's especially true. We don't even necessarily need to go into all the examples, but the consistent and constant evolution, I'll give the charitable term, evolution of language that we use to talk about certain issues. And as soon as someone uses an old term or, a term incorrectly, there's a whole population of people that just stop listening to that person because they're not versed enough in the new lingo about how to talk about this issue. Unhoused and homeless being a perfect example. You have some people, as soon as they hear the word homeless, they're everything just flatlines for them. Like, this conversation no longer has any value. And that's a crazy way to operate in the world. And obviously we're seeing it doesn't work well.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, as a social worker in the mental health and disability field, like, terms are changing all the time, right? As to what is considered appropriate or professional. And something I've learned is, like, if somebody's not using the most up-to-date, like somebody not in the profession is not using the most up-to-date terminology, like, you have to read the room and kind of figure out where their intentions are, right? Like, oh, right. They're not, they're talking about this issue. They're not belittling or dehumanizing. They're just using the language that they knew. And then, like, I try to be, like, super gentle about that. Oh, actually, it's called a cognitive disability, and it's not, the R word anymore, right? So, people aren't called retarded anymore. They're developmentally or cognitively disabled. And, just so that's what, because, like, if you attack somebody for using something like that term, in a conversation just because they don't know any better, like, you're going to shut everybody down. Then you're going to get, oh, I can't keep up with your standards. We're always getting canceled for saying the wrong thing.
Political correctness and blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they have a valid argument because they get their hands slapped constantly,
right?
Because of terminology, right? They're not. Yeah. Their identity is off because they're not using the right language.
Right.
One thing I think about is I think that people on the left and probably on the right, but I think that for reasons we can talk about, this doesn't happen as much. But on the left, we want to be able to say a fact or an idea to somebody and have that register in their mind and then change their thinking in some way that manifests in their action. But if you notice, when people actually pick up on things that you say, it's usually because you've said them a bunch of times and they're actually just imitating you more than they're consciously taking ideas on board. But once somebody is kind of imitating, then you can cognitively give them an idea. But I think that, and this is, I think, part of what makes us very human and is actually really efficient, is that we want to find a model that we could just copy. Because it's so efficient for us to do that. That's what we do in jiu-jitsu, essentially. Like, whenever I hear a little bit about, like, ecological dynamics, I hear it as you're sort of free form exploring something, which there can be total value in that. But also,
are y'all wanting to debate that right now?
But also, if you want to talk about identity battles, we could talk about ecological dynamics for a long ass time.
Never go full eco.
Never go full eco.
The idea that you could inform how that practice happens with here's some best practices to get going in your exploration, you can also do. But I really think that a lot of identity comes from imitating what we literally call role models, people that you should be able to copy. And the issue that we see in social media is that if I'm a trusted role model and I point at someone else and I say, you should trust them as your model for nutrition or something else, people will take that on board, because the most powerful way for a model to rise in the eyes of other people is for a good model to recommend them, right? And so once that happens, now people can get on board for some ideas that are a little bit off the beaten path, let's say. But at the same time, I think that we have to be careful, especially as progressives. We don't want to just tell people, here's the idea, here's the correct way to do it, but rather, do you admire the way that I treat people and I am in the world? Would you like to be my friend and be with me because you like the way you feel when you're with me? If so, perhaps this idea that I can express with words will land with you. But if not, the ideas I express with words will be poison to you. You will not want them at all. And I think on the left, sometimes this is not a skill that is developed, how to do this sort of thing, because the obsession becomes the language and the fact and the argument and the ad hominem and all the fallacies and all these things, when that's not how human beings operate, even if we wish it's how they operated.
Yeah, you know what this makes me think? Something that I observe people on the left often tend to do is they have very strongly held beliefs, as we all often do. But sometimes they don't offer a lot of wiggle room for education. They go right to punishment, right? So, Mike, you were talking about people who use language that we no longer consider appropriate, like the R word. This is a real pet peeve of mine. I hate that word. I know it hurts a lot of people, and it bothers me because there's a lot of people in the jiu-jitsu community who just keep using it. But the thing is, like, I not all of these people are trying to be malicious. It's like you said, Tim, some of these people are just, it's old habits from when they grew up. They copied it. And if you go after them and villainize them for it, you'll never change their mind. So I think that when you want to steer behavior, you have to have a proportionate response based on what they did, right? So like, as an example, if Donald Trump like disappears an innocent person to an El Salvador prison, right? I think it's reasonable for all of us to get on our soapbox and get pissed off about that. But if someone in good faith just ignorantly makes a comment that could be perceived the wrong way, I think you have to meet that with a bit of grace, and also keep in mind what the person's intent was. Was the person intending to be divisive and to be discriminatory and to hurt people? Or was this something that was said or done out of ignorance? Because if it was out of ignorance, that's teachable. But in order for it to be teachable, you have to be the kind of person that the other person wants to learn from. And you're only going to do that if you're likable, you're nice, and you're human, and you meet them at a human level. An example I can give, many, many, many years ago, probably over 10 years ago, I was in a room, I was at work, and a lawyer came in and gave us a speech about gender identity. And I remember they said something to the effect of, like, gender and sex are not the same thing. Gender is about identity, sex is about biology. And if you don't know that and you're not on board with that, you're a fucking bigot. And I remember thinking, okay, this is like, I am 100% on board with trans rights, with LGBTQ rights. I am 100% on board with that. But I had never, this is 10 years ago, I had never in my life heard that there was a difference between sex and gender. I had always thought they were the same thing. It had just never come up in my life that, oh, these are actually different. Well, I know that now. So if I want to sit down with someone who, hates trans people or has a problem with them, I can explain that, look, sex and gender are not the same thing. We're not arguing that these people are biologically born, whatever. Gender identity is a different concept. And we can educate people about that and get them on board. But if you sit someone down and just berate them, especially in an office environment where people are afraid they might get fired, you lose the battle of hearts and minds. And so I think we have to understand sometimes when people come at us with malicious energy, yes, we need to fight that tooth and nail. But when people come at us from an ignorant perspective, if you treat them like they're a bad person when they're just misinformed, you lose the opportunity to make a new friend and ally.
Yeah. One thing,
Right.
I might be disarming this tool by saying it out loud, but one thing I've found some success with is if I am in a situation like that, because here's the thing is it's tough to directly address something without it coming across as a statement of how you should think. Hey, that's not how we talk about this anymore. But one thing I found some success with is if that sort of thing comes up is I say, oh man, what's the philosophy behind that? And people, when I say the philosophy behind that, and I mean this, I want to know your world view. I'm willing to set aside, I'm only going to ask you that in a scenario where you can tell me about it. What's the philosophy behind that? I'll give you a few minutes. We could talk about it, because I think you immediately get into this position where I see you got to some conclusion. What led you to that? And can you spell it out for me? Because actually, if I'm wrong, I would like to know. But almost always it will become a discussion about how is a chair different than a table? How can we identify them categorically, philosophically? And that actually is how you open someone's mind to that, rather than, well, you just don't even understand epistemology and metaphysics. You got, it's that's not gonna crack the coconut,
Well, and I use a similar correction technique. I don't mean it to sound kind of obtuse, but if someone, I see or hear someone in my school get misgendered, and I know the other person that did it has no ill intent, oftentimes instead of directly correcting one person, I will correctly gender the person that was misgendered in a kind of a public setting with no correction, just modeling. And that problem goes away. I don't have to slap anybody's wrists. They're just like, oh, I made a mistake. I will fix that in the future. And nothing ever gets said about it. I don't have to persuade anybody, nothing. I just model the correct behavior and people follow the lead. And it's been such a great tool.
And the trans individuals that I know, some of them I've known before, during, and after their transition. And one thing that I learned, not being a member of that community myself, so I always am careful to mention that because I don't want people to assume that I'm talking for a community that I'm not a member of, right? But one thing that I've learned is most trans folks that I know, if there's a mistaken misgender, they don't get as bent up about it as we do, right? I mean, it's like, I'm bad with names, right? I have known all of you guys for a while, but like, in the jiu-jitsu school, we have so many people coming in and out, and I meet so many people in my job. I'm terrible with names. People aren't getting pissed because I forget their name or call them the wrong name, because it's in good faith, right? I'm not purposely calling them a name that they're not, right? So most of the trans people that I know, if there's an occasional misgendering, like, they've been like, well, you don't even need to make a big deal about it. Just say, oops,
Right.
sorry, and move on. But it depends on how it's done, whether it's in good faith or not. And that modeling, Jesse, is amazing. I've used the same thing myself, and it's a great way to do it.
I misgender non-trans people all the fucking time, right? It's
because I'm so beautiful.
Opportunity misgenderer, right? We all make mistakes. We're human.
Yeah.
Well, you guys
look at these eyelashes. These are gorgeous.
I was going to say, you guys are just androgynously beautiful. I mean, it's that, the sheen off of your bald heads, it blinds people to the appearance. And so they don't actually, but right. No, I mean, you bring up a good point. Like, look, this shit happens. I misgendered someone by accident yesterday. I felt bad about it. I was corrected. I said, oops, sorry. I just legitimately didn't know. It was someone I didn't know well, and I really hadn't spent a lot of time with in person. I made a mistake, and it was an accident. Sorry, we move on, right? It's like when you get someone's name wrong. Actually, I'm not Heather. My name is Huckabee or whatever, right? You correct it, you move on. It was a good faith mistake. I'm not trying to be an asshole about it. It's not a big deal unless someone makes it a big deal. And you probably shouldn't make it a big deal if it wasn't intended from a place of harm. But Tim, to your point, on the other hand, though, there's a line, right? Because there are times when it is meant maliciously. There was I just saw that clip of I don't know if it was like a city hall or Congress or something meeting in the States where basically someone was deliberately misgendering someone just as a form of disrespect. Like, I'm sorry, but fuck that, right? I mean, you should at least be able to respect people's identities, even if you don't agree with their politics. You wouldn't call someone by a fake name. Give them this carrot, right? Like, respect the fact that if people want to be addressed a certain way, you do that. That's just base level respect. You don't have to agree with everything they say, right? It's like if your doctor is a doctor, you can call them doctor. You wouldn't refuse to do that.
We do it for J.D. Vance.
It's true. And doesn't Ted Cruz actually have like a Hispanic name or something that,
He sure does.
People want to change their identity. And I really believe that in a modern democratic society, one of the most important freedoms that we have is the ability to choose our identity. If you take a look at one of the things that authoritarian governments will do, take a look at what's happening in El Salvador. A big part of what you do in an authoritarian government is you strip people of their identity, and you basically turn them into a number or a ghost. Having an identity is a freedom that we should all be able to enjoy in a democratic country. And that requires all of us to be on board with it. You don't have to agree with someone's life choices or political persuasion or gender identity, but you should at least have enough respect to address them the way that they would want to be addressed.
Yeah, the one experience I had that I actually made a mistake on this. I had a trans student who told me they preferred to be called they, and I had just never before referred to a singular as they. It was not like a motor pattern for me, and I misgendered them on accident. They not within a huff, they ended up leaving class like most people do, and I thought about it a lot because they had asked me to, and I'd made this mistake, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, I don't even really know how to reach out to this person. They came back to class. I guess they still liked the class, and then I got it right, and I apologized to them. I said, hey, I totally got this wrong. I have been thinking about that, and I want to apologize to you. And they're like, awesome. And then they like come to class, and now we're on great terms. And it was actually a positive experience that came from like me making a mistake, but them being forgiving, me trying to be like, I messed up. Can you totally forgive me? And it worked out fine.
There's a concept in the experience before.
Yep. Yep. And that doesn't just apply to gender identity. That applies to political identity as well, right? I mean, this is something that I always tell people. Like, if someone tells you, if you're anti-Trump, which I think we can probably safely say most of us are, if someone comes to you and tells you that they're like a MAGA person or a Trump supporter, and you immediately just verbally bitch slap them, like that is not a good look for you. And it also kills any opportunity of bridging that divide and learning, right? Because you don't have to agree with someone to learn from someone. And that is a very important lesson. We've talked about this a lot on BJJ Mental Models. I always talk about the importance of respecting your opponent or whoever you're discussing. It doesn't even have to be your opponent. That's just in the context of jiu-jitsu, it normally is. You have to respect your opponent in a combat sport. That doesn't mean you have to like them. It doesn't mean you have to want to train with them. It doesn't mean you agree with them. You might hate their guts. But respect isn't about liking someone. It's about acknowledging that there's benefits to taking someone seriously, right? I mean, I might really dislike someone in the jiu-jitsu community, but if I have a match against them, I will respect their abilities. I will study their abilities. I will take them seriously, because if you don't take your opponent seriously, you're going to get steamrolled, right? It is foolish to disregard other people because you don't agree with them. Everyone you can learn from. I mean, you can take the most awful, despicable person that you can think of, and if you actually sit down and unpack their life and how they got to where they're thinking, you probably won't wind up agreeing with them, but you'll probably learn something from how they arrived at those conclusions. And learning how they got there can help you understand the problem better. And I think that is a big, big issue with the left-right divide right now. Is it's so easy to demonize the other person. But like, look, just if you fucking sit down with these people, whether you're talking about like woke ass left liberals or hardcore MAGA Trump supporters, if you sit down with them and put aside the need to agree with them and just ask them to explain their thinking, you'll learn a lot about their life. And you'll probably realize, you know what, there's probably millions of other people who have similar experiences, and those experiences don't align with mine. And I still think you're wrong. And I still think you need to change your mind. And I still disagree with you on a moral basis. But I'm a better person for now understanding your lived experience, and that better equips me to deal with people in your situation. And that's such an important skill set to have.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that if you can sit down with someone and you disagree with them and you ask them, why is it that you support the things that you do? And they start telling you about what their major concerns are, and you try to draw them in to a conversation about how that's actually being expressed in your country or through your government. It's like, if we're talking to each other, we're looking at each other, but we're actually facing opposite directions. I might be facing north looking at you, and you might be facing south looking at me. And we can spend all the time in the world describing the scenery that I see, and you describe the scenery you see. But maybe it's more productive if one of us just turns to align with the other and say, hey, do you see the same thing I see? Awesome. Let's turn around and see what that other perspective was for a moment. Now we got a full compass to work with.
Holy crap, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, it is terrific.
It absolutely is. Like in the negotiation world, they always tell you that you should focus on interests and not positions, right? Because people will give you their position, like we must do things this way. And if you have two people with competing positions, sometimes it appears that there's no way that they could ever get on the same page. But if you tell them, okay, take a step back and like, what is your actual interest here? What is it that you're trying to achieve? Your real goal, like not the tactical stuff on the ground that you want to do that you're proposing, but what's the real problem that you're feeling that we need to solve? And if you do that and you focus on interests, what you almost always find is there's more alignment there than you would think. I mean, the example I give is, you know, for people who are Republican, I absolutely disagree with a lot of the actions that Donald Trump does. But if Kamala Harris had won the election and she had come up and put a rational case and said like, hey, look, we feel like we need to tighten the border. We feel like we it's not as regulated as we want it to be. We're worried the population is growing faster than the infrastructure can handle it. So we're going to do some border tightening. I don't think anyone would agree with or would disagree heavily with that statement. It's when you start talking about how they're all rapists and murderers and you start deporting them to El Salvador, that's where understandably people get pissed off. But if you were to wind that back and actually meet people at a base level, what are you trying to solve? Are you just worried about immigration? Well, every country is allowed to have an immigration policy. That's not crazy. It's the specific way that they're solving for this that is crazy.
But if we can about it.
Exactly. But if we can meet people at that level and agree that, okay, look, at least we both agree that it's okay to have an immigration policy, maybe now we can start figuring out a solution that's mutually agreeable. And that is a big problem that I see right now is the left will not admit at all that there's any merit to anything the right is saying, and the right will not admit at all that there is any merit to the way that to what the left is saying. And I think that if we were to actually take a step back and talk about interests, yeah, I mean, as an example, right, as a Canadian, tariffs are a hot topic right now. Look, if Kamala Harris were elected and said, hey, look, we feel like a lot of American industries are suffering and we want to rebuild them. So over the next few years, we're going to institute a bunch of tariffs and rules and regulations to try to rebuild American industry while respecting our trading partners and kind of weaning off of foreign dependencies. I don't think anyone would be seriously upset about that. It's when you basically get, treated abusively and you're threatened with annexation and you're told you're not a real country. Now that's a solution that is definitely going to rile feathers for no good reason. But if we had taken a step back and just talked about foreign trade, like we should be able to have some sort of objective agreement that at least, yeah, there's a real problem here that we can solve. And we're losing that right now. People go right to like, what is my position? And nothing you say will make them budge from their position.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think part of these issues come from information bubbles, right? Like the information that the four of us are getting is probably far different from the information that the people on the farther right are getting. And I'm wondering how we can deal with that. Does that make sense? Like, I know Fox News says totally different things than the news outlets that I read.
Yeah, a couple ideas are coming to mind right now. One of them I just wanted to double up on because it really resonated with me, Steve, when you said interest versus positions as kind of a further extension of identity and values. It sat with me for a moment as you were talking because it is true that I think values by itself does not complete someone's identity. It's just the things that they want their identity to be able to sustain through what essentially is positions and interests. And as you were talking, it sounded like sometimes what starts off as interests evolves in a discussion into someone's position that often feels like an identity is being attacked. So the way you described what a hypothetical Harris border position was about numbers, about tightening the border for certain metrics, versus all of the people from that place are bad. Or if we need to have tariffs because like this number at a tariff, it really makes sense. We get manufacturing going like that would be really good and we expect 5,000 jobs, then 8,000 versus Canada sucks and they should be our country now is a totally different animal because it's identity that's being attacked rather than like imperfect trading routes, imperfect marketplaces, market failures, things like this.
Yeah. If you want to make an enemy, attack someone by their identity. You'll never get them back.
Yeah.
Fair.
I got to keep that in.
Another thing that we kind of talked about too, which I think is worth touching on, is an acknowledgement that we're all imperfect. We all make mistakes. There needs to be some tolerance for mistakes if they were made in good faith, or even if people do something that wasn't in good faith. If they are legitimately apologetic about it and they want to be better, we have to, we should give them a path to redemption as long as it wasn't something completely reprehensible, right? But I mean, people make mistakes. Good people do bad things, and we should try to find a way to reintegrate these people rather than just permanently dismissing them. Another example, I remember one time I was part of a work meeting, and everyone was talking about the importance of standing up to racism and like zero tolerance for racism. One strike, you're out. We cannot allow racism in this community. And there was an older, much more experienced guy, a brilliant guy, and he kind of chimed up and said, well, you have to bear in mind, you're racist. I'm racist. Everyone is racist, right? The reason why this is such a problem is because we all have stupid biases, and sometimes they catch us even when we don't realize we're doing it. So if you set a policy where it's like one strike, you're out, even for the most trivial infraction, you're creating a culture where you can't fix any problems because no one will admit they exist, right? Like as an example, if I were to publicly tell you, Mike, I think you're a racist, right? That is like you are going to get so defensive and so angry at me because that is basically what I'm doing is saying something that could kill your professional career. But on the other hand, if I pull you aside and say, hey, Mike, you said that word that you said, we don't say that anymore. My bad. You probably don't know that, but let's not say that anymore. It's much less controversial. And so you have to allow some room for the fact that we're all human and we make mistakes. You never want a situation where people are so afraid to make mistakes that they will deny them no matter what, because the harm of admitting you made a mistake is too great. And that's a risk that we sometimes wind up getting into, is we don't have a path to redemption. We don't leave we don't leave room for good faith mistakes that we can correct. And so that's an important thing, right? In any system, when you're building a system and you want it to be fault tolerant, you cannot suppress the faults. You have to be willing to talk openly about the faults and the errors that can happen. Otherwise, you get a situation like Trump trying to delete the COVID data because he doesn't want people to know that COVID exists, right? That's not how you really solve a problem.
I mean, we talk about it in jiu-jitsu all the time, right? Mistakes and failure is how progress occurs. That's how we move the ball forward. If we're not fucking up and we're not making mistakes, we're not learning. And I think the same is true in life.
Yeah, and it seems like they should always seek to exist in a proportion where the value of the lesson must exceed the cost of the mistake. And so whenever we can, we should reduce the cost of a mistake. That's why we need things like it being good faith, because that reduce our friction with going, no, we can forgive you for that. But if it wasn't in good faith, it's obviously an indicator of maybe future behavior, things like this. But the mistake cannot be very costly, hence why we try to nip things in the bud. That's where that saying would come from. And then the lesson itself has to be informative, or it can't be like, the cost of the mistake is low, but also you're fired. Like the cost of mistake just became extremely high at that point, you know?
Yeah. I'll give you an example.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll give you a good example. So I worked at a company one time where, as you do, there's like an all hands Slack channel. So there's like, hundreds of people in this fucking chat group. And one of the guys, just without realizing it, says something racist. So what he said was he talked about how he got gypped, right? Which I actually, for a long time, I did not realize that was actually a racial slur. It was just, no one had ever mentioned it to me, but it is a racial slur against gypsies. And this was made in good faith. This guy had no idea that this was a racial slur. I mean, growing up in the 80s, I did not know this until like a few years ago myself.
And we said so much bad shit in the 80s.
Yeah, jeez. And so the proper thing to do in that situation would be to like just DM this guy and just say, hey, just so you know, like that's not a cool thing anymore. It's actually a racial term. You probably didn't know that. Most of us didn't, but now we know. Let's not do it again. What happened instead was some other person jumped on him and sent a message to the whole company talking about how inappropriate this was and how an apology is immediately warranted. And I mean, that's like, you're going after this guy's career at this point for something that was a good faith, honest mistake. He just had no idea. And that's the kind of thing that we have to be careful of, because if you create a culture where you can't, even an accidental error can't, is just an immediate like game ender, then you deny the opportunity to fix that problem and to educate that person. Because if the culture is such that a single error or single mistake is like, that's going to kill your inclusion in the group right there, then no one will ever admit to a mistake. And we don't want that, right? Like, we want to educate the people that we can, while simultaneously standing up to the people that we can't. There is a line, and a lot of people are on the good side of that line, and we need to try to keep them as part of that group and educate them rather than drive them out.
Yeah, this brings to mind I know this is not the podcast for it, but this brings to mind teaching jiu-jitsu. And a lot of times when you teach somebody, the person who needs like the least encouragement is the person who is really physically fit and just really wants to roll and spar, and they're just good to go. And you don't really worry about them on that front. But there are people who come in and you can tell it's going to be tough for them to get through their first class. It's going to be tough for them to come to their second class, but you really want them to. Because you know that if they stick with it, you're like, I've seen every type of person become a black belt. I know you can do it. And you find this way to slowly invite them in. And the way you do it is not by saying, you did that wrong, let me just help you. You did that wrong, let me help you. That doesn't feel like helping to them. What you do is you give them very low friction ways, very no fail ways to succeed. And then they can move forward, and then they want to come back because they're succeeding. But right. To that first athletic person who was really good, that success might not look like anything to them. That's like day one for them, but it is success for the second person. And that is something you can build on. And when somebody realizes like you're a safe person to learn with or to be invited to do something with, it's like, you can learn anything together. You can have very lively disagreements and come away better friends for it rather than less.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like we talk in jiu-jitsu and in life about the importance of psychological safety, being part of a community where you feel like you can present yourself vulnerably without fear. And that's really the key of any high-performing organization. If people are afraid to speak up, you're already screwed. And so I worry sometimes that the divisiveness of modern culture makes people quieter than they should be. Like the number of comments I've got that are quite frankly shocked that people are even willing to have this kind of conversation that we are is surprising to me. I mean, there's probably millions of people around the world who train jiu-jitsu, and most people aren't willing to have this kind of conversation because it doesn't feel psychologically safe. And from reading the comments, I completely understand that sometimes, right? You know, you're putting yourself out there. And so before you write that nasty comment, regardless of the intention, you should always think about, am I doing something that is going to make this problem worse? Right? What's the second order effect of me posting this nasty comment? You know, if I tell this Trump supporter that he's a racist asshole, right? What's the second order effect? That's probably going to change the way forever that person interacts with the political system. And that doesn't help anybody if we make this divide even greater and even harder to bridge.
Yeah, I know I keep going on about these things, but one thing that I would think about is, you notice when somebody is in jiu-jitsu and they are a heavy competitor, their attitude almost has to be about beating and being better than everyone else, because that's what competing is. And you end up focusing on the people around you as people that assist you in doing that. Maybe they're your friends, et cetera, but identifying with a competitor. I noticed, because I identified with as being a teacher before I had much success as a competitor, which is kind of an odd dynamic. It's usually the other way around. And I found that identifying as a competitor put these like strange attitudes in my mind that I had moved away from once I identified as a teacher. And once I was identifying as a teacher, almost all of my concerns were, how do I keep students interested, get them as good as possible as best I can, keep them coming back, make sure to address all their concerns. But I noticed that just that one change in identity in me changed how I could see a room of people that I'm with. And they're all the same people still.
Well said, man.
That's really insightful. Yep.
So what are some things that we can do then? I mean, having this conversation is part of addressing the identity issue and addressing how we treat other people out in the world, regardless of identities and or what their political beliefs might be. But what do you think we can do in general to kind of help address this? Like this conversation's one thing, but what are some other things that we think that we can do to help bring people together rather than this divisiveness that we've got?
Well, I mean, I know one thing we can do is walk the walk, right? Model this out in the world. You know, we've talked about how to interact with one another and how to behave in the world and how to model the things that we want to be headed towards. I mean, I think that's a really simple way that if more people started doing that, we could make a lot of progress.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I've been intentionally doing over the past several months is I want to make sure that my online presence matches who I am, right? If you talk with me online, my goal is that you're going to know me. You're going to know who I am. And when we meet in person, when we have this conversation, this is the first time Tim and I have ever actually spoken to each other, when it's not behind a keyboard. You know, my hope is that Tim's getting the same experience of me that he's gotten online, right?
The authentic Mike Mahaffey experience.
Yes, except you can't smell me, which is probably better. But no, I mean, yeah. And so in terms of walking the walk, Jesse, like that's been on my mind a lot lately, you know, and thanks to Steve and BJJ Mental Models. And, you know, I kind of have a teeny little platform right now. It's not just people I know in person anymore. So I've been really, really trying to be careful with that. I think maybe modeling that, hopefully somebody somewhere is going to see that and be like, oh, maybe that's how I should treat other people too. Like treat them just like I would if they were in front of my face, you know? Maybe.
I don't know how much you guys are like, because I'm very new to doing this. My first podcast was that one that we put out, and then we did one for BJJ Mental Models. So I've been thinking quite a bit about the conversations afterward, and I noticed that it has a similar effect to me as whenever you kind of talk to a friend about a set of ideas and you are digesting them through the course of the week or the next few days, and it pushes you to be aware in moment to moment instances. Am I doing that? Could I be doing that a little bit better? Am I losing sight of something important? So in a sense, it's like making a public affirmation of things that you can expect from me. And therefore I will then model them, as Jesse and Mike are saying, like to then model it. But the other thing maybe is, I know I find this really useful, is sometimes you have like these ideas floating in your head, or you want to express something that you feel very deeply and sincerely, but you've never had the language for it. I mean, it's the reason we love fantasy and fiction and things like this, is we get to have our imagination gain color to the palette and to be able to better express ourselves. And sometimes I think that when you hear people talk and you relate to them and you feel like you could be friends with them and they have values that you share, maybe they never tell you what those are, but they give you ways of expressing them to your friends that then help those friends understand those values as well. Like providing you the language for your ideas, I think, is another thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's one of the main reasons I think why these conversations are important, even if, there's always the risk of blowback or of alienating people. I think it's important to put your ideas out there because if nothing else, it models the behavior, but also it gives you the ability to verbalize things, which can sometimes be a very powerful educator. A lot of the time we don't really deeply reflect on a lot of the stuff that we really think, it's just kind of there in the head. But once you have to put it into words, you have to really make that idea concrete. Again, back to jiu-jitsu as an example, one of the things that we always say is that teaching is one of the best ways to learn. And anyone who has gotten to black belt knows that to be true. There will be days where some white belt asks you a question like, so why are you telling me to put my hand here? And then you're about to speak and then you realize, fuck, I don't know. I've just been doing that my whole life. I have no idea why I'm telling you to put your hand here, except that 10 years ago, someone told me to do it and I just did it without thinking. And so when you start having to verbalize and explain things, it shakes loose in your head a lot of the unconscious biases and decisions that you may have made over the years that kind of like thought patterns that have just been ingrained that you don't even question anymore. And sometimes that can really open your eyes to the fact that, fuck, there's a lot of stuff I'm saying or doing that really either I don't think it works, or there's no evidence for why I should do it, or maybe even it's actually logically consistent with the things that I say that I believe, which is a very important thing to understand. If you find those inconsistencies, you only get those if you're willing to verbalize and have conversations with people, right? And to your point, Tim, sometimes people just say something that sticks with you. Like a big part of the reason I wanted to do this is because there were a few quotes that I heard passing around. I was always under the impression that like politics and jiu-jitsu, put a wall between them, they should be separate. But there's been a lot of quotes that I've seen floating around. One of them is that old quote about how if you wanted to know how you would have behaved in 1930s Germany, you're finding out right now because this is that moment for you. There's also that great quote about how it's important to speak up because if you don't speak up, it's not necessarily about changing another person's mind, but it's because if you don't speak up, then you have allowed them to change you as a person. And that really stood out to me too, that silence, when you are silent in the face of injustice or wrongdoing, you are not only are you failing to speak up, but you are allowing the situation to change you as a person, because you are becoming the kind of person who is at least okay enough with this behavior that you're not going to do anything about it. And that was the kind of stuff that made me realize I have to rethink this no politics in jiu-jitsu stance that I've taken my whole life. I think there is a time when there has to be politics in jiu-jitsu because they're too tightly intertwined at this point.
And, I think this is probably maybe an oversimplification, but a restatement of something I think I heard Tim say, and it goes back to that teaching of jiu-jitsu. Oftentimes the why is way more important than the what. And if we can understand the why of things internally and the people that we're talking to, I think we're going to make a lot more progress than when we get stuck and mired in the what, the policy, right?
Yeah, you find when you talk to somebody that if you can have a real Socratic approach where you're asking them the question so that the premise that they have or the conclusion is something they arrive at on their own, and that can only happen if you're very informed as to what those questions should be, is what you're saying, Jesse. You ask them the appropriate why questions. Why would we have separation of powers into three branches of government? Things like this. And you can get them to conclude to what should essentially be the position maybe you think they should have.
Yeah. And it can also make you realize that maybe the things that you heard are not the things that were said. So as an example, I was talking to a Trump supporter, and they were explaining to me why they supported Trump. And they said things like, we're tired of, they told me that they were tired of outsiders coming in and changing the culture of their community. And it's like, at first I'm thinking like, oh, that doesn't sound good. But then I pried a little bit deeper and I found out this guy's talking about mega corporations. He's mad that like Starbucks and Costco are coming into his business or coming into his, his community and are driving out all of the small businesses. If I just interpreted at face value what he said, I would have assumed that he was a giant racist and wanted to keep people of color out of his community. But I kept asking, and it turns out he's just real pissed at Starbucks, which I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? That's a stance that you and I are actually we agree on, right? I don't think it's good that these fucking billionaires and their companies are coming in and destroying mom and pop corporations. 100% in agreement with you. And we never would have got to that conclusion if I had just cut you off at the first thing you said.
Yeah, sometimes you have to ask why a few times to really get to the core of it, right?
Yeah, and oftentimes you can ask people why till you're blue in the face, and even the reasons they give you may not be the actual reasons, but they're just the best understanding that they have, and they're the reasons that come up when that's the understanding you have. The same is true for me, I'm sure, but by getting into that depth and getting into the weeds, if you get to a single point where they feel understood, then it's safer to take a journey into the unknown with you. But if at that single point where they were like, man, maybe I don't know what that was, and then you excoriate them for it, like, man, you burned a really valuable opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a saying in the engineering world, it's called the 5 whys. And the idea is if you want to do a post-mortem and really understand why something happened, you have to ask why at least 5 times. So for example, like the server went down. Why did the server go down? Well, it's because, someone forgot to run an automated procedure on it. Okay, why did they forget to do that? Well, because it wasn't documented. Okay, why wasn't it documented? Because the person was too busy to document it. Why were they too busy? Because they were ordered by a manager to do something else. Why did the manager order them to do that? Because we're understaffed. Okay, now we get to the root of the problem, right? The root of the problem is not that the engineer made the mistake. The root of the problem is that we're so understaffed and so under-resourced that people are getting pulled away from things that are important. So if you think that was the engineer's fault, you put the blame in the wrong place, right? And when you ask 5 whys like that, a lot of problems like, systemic issues in society about inequality and discrimination, a lot of them you kind of realize that maybe the place we're pointing the finger isn't the right place. Maybe the problem is different from what we thought it was. And you only learn that if you ask why over and over and over again until you get to the real kernel of truth.
Read 100%.
Jesse, I think you're being attacked by some sort of weird Kentucky wildlife there. I don't know what you've got. I'm going to assume it's
some sort of flying alligator, maybe. I don't
flying
know.
Alligator. I don't know. What is it anyway?
I think it's the Mothman. That's Virginia, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Ohio River Valley. I'm sure he's made appearances.
Yeah.
And anything else that we want to cover, guys? I really liked this chat. I think this was a cool one.
This has been great. I've had a blast.
It was wonderful to meet and talk to the other 2 that I hadn't yet met.
Same. Let's do it again soon.
Same, 100%.
Yeah.
We got to come out to your place once you get a place set up, Tim.
Yeah, or maybe I'll come out to all of you and we can roll around, do some jiu-jitsu.
Okay,
that would be
awesome.
Presuming that I'm not permanently banned from entering the country now because of this podcast, I would love to come down there at some point and see you guys too.
We want you back, Steve.
Yeah. If I wind up in El Salvador, if they shave my head and throw me in a camp, I want to know that at least one of you guys is going to show up and try to get me out like that guy did in the States. Okay, thanks. I appreciate
all of
it.
us. Separate flights or the same flight, whatever it has to be.
Nice. Well,
right.
let's do some plugs. Tim, if people want to follow you and check out your sassy quips on social media, how do they do that?
Everything is Timothy Lee Peterson, all spelled out.
Amazing. Mr. Mahaffey, if people want to check out your sassy quips or learn how to do jiu-jitsu when you're old and decrepit, your specialty, how do they go about doing that?
You can find me at Old Bastard BJJ on Instagram and Threads, and then at Magic BJJ in Lansing, Michigan.
Nice. And Mr. Jesse, if people want to train at the friendliest gym in Louisville, how do they do that?
You can find us at Rough Hands BJJ on the socials and here in Louisville, Kentucky.
Amazing. And all of our stuff, my stuff is at bjjmentalmodels.com. You can actually hear all 3 of these lovely people on that podcast at some point as well. So there are the plugs. Thanks a lot, guys. I had a good time on this one. This is a topic that's been kind of percolating for me, at least, in my head a bit, and I'm super glad that, Tim, you suggested this one.
Yeah, this was good.
Yeah, appreciate you guys.
Amazing. All right, thanks, guys. Talk to you next time.
Yep.